Two are Irish-born, Irish immigrants at the time of the war, Shields and Dunphy. Kirker was German and in a German-speaking regiment, and Huidekoper was of Dutch descent, but second or third generation, I think. So this is America of the 1860s. You could say it's a cross-section of the military even now.
Robert Hicks has a PhD. He's served as a Navy officer. He served in law enforcement. He served as a director of the Beauty Museum and served at the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. He has degrees in maritime history, anthropology, and archaeology. He's also an author. His most recent book is The Civil War Medicine, A Surgeon's Experience. Robert, if there's anything that I left unsaid or anything you wanted to add to that, please do. Anything of relevance. And if you could just tell us what your topic is today.
I appreciate that very much. The only correction is my most recent book is the book that just came out, which is what I'm going to talk about.
Oh, nice. Very good. All right. Very, very good. And we will promote that as well. I will go ahead and mute myself and give it away to you. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Rob.
And thank you. Yes. And thank you all for spending a bit of your Sunday afternoon on this day when we really should be outside doing this with me. Bear with me for a moment. I'm going to put a PowerPoint on the screen and then go from there. Wounded for Life, title of my book and also my presentation. This presentation is taken from my book just out. But some of you may know me as the director of the Mütter Museum for over a decade. I'm no longer affiliated with that institution, so I'm independent. And but this topic and the book on this topic began deep into my tenure there when inspiration came for an exhibit on the medical dimension of the Civil War. But my most recent book up until this past week was the one on the left, which in the introduction mentioned Civil War medicine. That was from a few years ago, but this is the new one, just out, Wounded for Life. So the presentation today is taken from this book, and the subtitle is 7 Union Veterans of the Civil War. Now, the people that I portray in this book are here, except for one, Presley, Dawson / Dorsey, I have represented by a veteran's badge because no photograph of him survives. So I've got one physician, Dr. Mitchell, and 6 soldiers, and 3 officers, 3 enlisted men, one of whom is a sailor, 4 white and 2 black. The 4 white soldiers are all connected through Dr. Mitchell. These are men, they served in different capacities during the war, but what all of these men have in common is they suffered pretty extreme wounds and survived them. And my book takes a different view than other books that talk about veterans. First of all, the number of books in recent years that focus on the veterans of the Civil War have been relatively few. But I've taken a very specific approach to this, Wounded for Life. I present a wound's eye view of these soldiers. And excuse me, let me go back again. I'm getting little messages pop up about admitting people to the room, but I assume GAR can handle that.
Correct.
Okay, good. I won't have to answer those. So of these men, it's a real cross-section of the United States at the time, and maybe even now as well. The 2 black soldiers, one possibly came from an enslaved background. In any case, the background's pretty murky. The other one, apparently, Thomas Hawkins, was a free black man at the time and actually served as a substitute. Of this group, 2 are Irish-born, Irish immigrants at the time of the war, Shields and Dunphy. Kirker was German and in a German-speaking regiment, and Huidekoper was of Dutch descent, but second or third generation, I think. So this is America of the 1860s. You could say it's a cross-section of the military even now. 3 of these men ultimately received the Medal of Honor before it was a Congressional Medal of Honor. And one peculiarity of that is that none of these soldiers received their medal contemporary with the action in which they participated, for which they got the medal. The medals came much, much later. and in at least two cases after some serious lobbying to get them. So the connection through the physician is a survey. Now, I'll say a little bit more about Dr. Mitchell in a minute. It may not be a name familiar to you, but there is certainly one phenomenon associated with him and Civil War soldiers that you are going to recognize, but I'll get to that. But in the 1890s, Mitchell and his son, who grew up to be a doctor, decided to conduct a survey, questionnaire of a select group of veterans. They got names and addresses of these veterans through the War Department. And one of them was Captain Kirker. You saw his head and shoulders a moment ago, but this is him after his discharge from the military. You see he's missing an arm and a leg here. He completed a questionnaire. This is just one page of it to give you a flavor of it. But the Mitchells sent out a survey asking a lot of very specific, detailed, and intimate questions about these men's bodies. And remember, they're being asked these questions decades after the war, long after they've moved away, moved back home, maybe gone to other parts of the country, moved west, got married, had children, and all of these men did get married and have children after the war. And it is a snapshot of a moment much later in life of what their bodies were doing, what their bodies, how they experienced their bodies. And it's an interesting reflection to consider what their bodies were doing or not doing and what they were doing in other realms of life. So a wound's eye view is the approach that I took in the book based on this survey. The two black soldiers I included because I thought they ought to be, even though they were not surveyed. As far as I know, Mitchell only treated white soldiers in his pioneering work and did not particularly have an accommodating view of black men in uniform. So we're going to focus on two and give you a sketch of these two in relationship to my idea of a wound's eye view. And let's start with Huidekoper. And he's sort of a hometown boy in a way. As you'll see, he has a lot of Philadelphia connections. But he's born in Meadville, Crawford County. Family has done well. They had immigrated from the Netherlands, born in 1839. These dimensions for his body are, as of age 52, taken from a medical exam later on, just to give you an idea of what he might look like physically. He musters in. He is made an officer, in fact, second in command of the 150th Pennsylvania Volunteers. He has a large family. He has brothers who also serve in the war. They are all very committed abolitionists. They all are very big champions of the Union cause. They have some means because the family has made it big in the wool and mill industry. Now, just at the time the war was breaking out, Huidekoper was a student at Harvard. His next younger brother was also a student at Harvard at the time. They were also friends of another student you may have heard of named Robert Lincoln, and were very much in tune with what they were reading about Abraham Lincoln's speeches, House Divided, and so forth. Those pre-war speeches that made him very famous and is showing in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Huidekoper read and thought, this man is the man for the country in the time of crisis. So let's move up to Huidekoper's been in the military now with his regiment for some months, almost a year, and now we're on July 1st in the fight at Gettysburg. In fact, the opening fight really happens in the McPherson Farm area where Huidekoper and the 150th and his brigade are placed. His brigade is greatly inferior to the Confederate forces that they see moving upon them. But in the fight around the farm, the 150th was sort of deployed in an L-shaped fashion for part of the time. Huidekoper shot in the leg. He gets up, he continues to fight, but the fight is so severe that all the officers in the brigade, almost all, are disabled or they're at least wounded to some degree. In Huidekoper's case, he's got a wounded leg. His commanding officer's been shot through the mouth, can't talk. So Huidekoper takes over and continues to direct the operation in a significant moment before this brigade is forced to retreat back to the Lutheran cemetery up the hill and then finally through Gettysburg to Cemetery Hill, where they stayed for the next 2 days. But Huidekoper is shot again, and this time it's in the right elbow, and the gunshot pretty much takes his elbow away. shreds the tendons. He loses the ability to make any movement with his forearm. He's bleeding. He's in difficulties. The farm itself is being used as a makeshift operating room, first aid station. He gets treatment in there and goes back out and continues to lead his troops until he can't do it anymore. The loss of blood is too great. He's now fatigued and he's getting dizzy and passing out. So he relinquishes command and he walks up to the Lutheran seminary, where there's also an aid station, but Union troops are retreating now back through the town and to take up their final position in the famous fishhook thing. So he goes down into town, walks that distance from the moment of his original wounding. It's over a mile now. And of course, there's gunfire going on and Confederate troops are entering the town. He goes to this Catholic church, which on the left-hand side is the appearance of this church in 1863. It looks like now on the right-hand side, and it's open all the time during the day, and you can go in and see it. And this is a picture of one of the stained glass windows. But if you imagine Huidekoper approaching the one on the left, there's an operating table set up on the front porch in front of those double doors. And he's told by an orderly, you're going to have to go in and wait your turn. So he goes inside and he waits until he can come out and have his arm amputated. By this point, the Confederates have overrun this place, and it must have been a bizarre scene because here's Huidekoper on the operating table. Confederate soldiers are grouping around to watch the operation. Some of them are going into the church to commandeer the people still in there, and it's full of wounded men waiting for medical treatment. Those are willing to walk. They trot out, make them take their shoes and socks off, and then use them to carry captured muskets to the rear. So Huidekoper's there. His arm is amputated. He's chloroformed, although he gets on the table and he says, wait until my chloroform takes effect before you take the arm off. And the surgeon says, sorry, it's already done. Just did it. Huidekoper goes back in the church for a time while Confederates occupy the place, and then he's taken to a nearby house where he recuperates for the next 10 days. So the battle happens while he's recuperating in a house. He can hear it all going on. And then he's taken to another hospital, evacuated after the Confederates leave the town. So let's leave him for a moment. But before we do, Abraham Lincoln is going to play a role in Huidekoper's subsequent military life. You may recall that Lincoln had a company of soldiers assigned to him, of which he became very fond during the war and insisted that those soldiers stay with him. This was a company of the 150th under Huidekoper's direction. So because troops were assigned to Lincoln, it was important for Huidekoper to check in with the president. And mindful that Huidekoper's 5'8" and Lincoln ain't. It was an interesting meeting, which Huidekoper recorded. Huidekoper goes to see Lincoln and talk about the disposition of the soldiers. And Lincoln looks at him up and down. He said, I thought this colonel was going to be maybe bigger and a little bit fatter than you. But Lincoln then takes a very serious expression of face and says to Huidekoper, now, your captain here, I asked him a question that he just can't answer, and I hope you can. And Huidekoper thinks, what could this question be? This serious president looking at me. And Lincoln says, what I want to know is, you are of Dutch descent, correct? Yes, I am. Well, tell me then, what is the difference between an Amsterdam Dutchman and any other damn Dutchman? So a moment of hilarity and fast friendship is made. And Huidekoper makes repeated visits. Well, Huidekoper's wound is such that he's eager to get back leading his regiment, even with a part of an arm missing. That does in fact happen, but the recovery is difficult for Huidekoper, and he's given a medical discharge. But he still wants to stay in the game. And the only way he can think of to do that is to pay a visit to President Lincoln, which he does, ask Lincoln to write a note to the War Department saying, give me any job I want, which Lincoln does. And Huidekoper gets a job assigned to muster recruits, fresh recruits for the 150th in Philadelphia, which he does, and then delivers them to the regiment. But after that, he's forced to quit the military and go home. We'll come back to him, but now let's look at the other man I want to talk about, Presley, Dorsey, or Dawson, Black soldier, doesn't come from a background at all similar to Huidekoper's. The best that I can determine, Dorsey was enslaved before the war, somehow got away from that, and I believe he was enslaved in Maryland. He makes his way to Lancaster County, in fact, to the town of Lancaster, where he enlists in 1864. You may or may not be able to see that on this volunteer enlistment form, but the enlisting officer is a man named Thaddeus Stevens. Now, not to be confused with the famous Pennsylvania congressman of that time, but this Thaddeus Stevens was his nephew. So here he is enlisted, and he is sent to Camp William Penn. We'll get to that in a moment. So our man is not literate. Any documents where a legal signature is required for him for the rest of his life is signed with an X. In fact, everyone in his social circle, even those who subsequently have to give affidavits to the Pension Bureau on his behalf, are all non-literate, which means that anything that is recorded according to how the person recording hears it. And I mention this because undoubtedly Dorsey spoke with a dialect from his community, which may not have translated well to the ears of a white educated recruiting officer. So the details of the background get a little bit mixed depending on who's recording it. It's possible that either Howard or Harford County in Maryland is where he came from. One of those counties at the time abounded in place names for Dorsey. So that's probably a good hint, and the other county doesn't. So we don't know his precise date of birth, and as far as the military is concerned, he is a laborer. So he's at Camp William Penn and assigned to the 43rd United States Colored Infantry. Here are his measurements as taken from a much later medical report. And notice the yellow complexion, hazel eyes. At the time, he would have been categorized as mulatto, but not necessarily in every case. And it has been absolutely impossible to try to locate him in any slave schedule in the census before the war. And as many of you know, names of slaves were usually not recorded, just their age and not much else, just to count them for census purposes. That may have been the case for this man, in which case there were many people of his age in the census for several places in Maryland at this time, so it's impossible to narrow it down. Briefly promoted as a corporal, but then returned to rank as private, not necessarily for any disciplinary reason that can be discerned. There's nothing in the military record. It may be that the lack of literacy was a problem. His company is formed and sent to Petersburg. Now, his regiment, as it was forming, once it reached at least a critical mass, was sent away to get to the front, which happened to be Petersburg, in the trenches. So the 43rd arrived down there just in time to get planned into the assault that became the Battle of the Crater. But that did not include Dorsey. Now, in the military now, he has changed his name to Dawson, which he uses pretty consistently throughout the war, and then goes by Dorsey again afterwards. Not uncommon to change names for military service. It may be also, if he's an escaped slave and worried about that, he would change his name. That just makes sense. So he arrives in Petersburg days after the Battle of the Crater. So he arrives in a Petersburg that looks like this. Now, the two color pictures are reconstructed images from around Petersburg today to give visitors an idea what these entrenchments look like. So the photo on the left, this could be a World War I trench because this was siege warfare that was very much in the mode of that next big war. But on this date, August 28th, probably while under Confederate cannon fire, he's making his way through trenches, and something causes trenches around him to collapse. So imagine these logs breaking loose and tumbling down on top of him. He is injured in his leg. It dislocates his kneecap, and the tibia and fibula underneath are partially crushed. Oddly enough, he does not get medical treatment. Either he decided that I'm okay, I'm fine, don't worry about it, or for some reason, supervisors decided he wasn't hurt bad enough to go to the hospital. But that's not the end of his maladies at Petersburg. He doesn't get shot, but now he gets bitten by a mosquito of a kind that you don't want to hear from. The Plasmodium falciparum, a form of malaria, is the worst form, and he gets it. And this time he has to be hospitalized. The symptoms you see here, the sweating, chills, vomiting, weakness, and so on. And left untreated, it can go much deeper into other bodily maladies. So he is treated, and he is treated at City Point. This hospital is part of a very large depot and complex supporting Grant's overland campaign, but it also has a very, very large hospital site that was treating thousands and thousands of patients. It had a separate ward for Black soldiers. So this was probably the first time Dawson had any experience of being in a hospital, much less a hospital that actually had Black doctors and Black nurses. But the interesting thing is the official military record only mentions the malarial debility. There's no mention at all of any problem with his leg or knee. And we know this went untreated because a later pension document has an affidavit from his wife that says he always walked lame. Each time he put his right foot down and stepped forward, his right foot would turn out 90 degrees to the side. So it would be a very awkward way of walking, but it apparently didn't interfere with his marching. So he's back in business with the regiment and sees Richmond fall and knows that the end of the war has taken place. But the war may be ended, but the government is not done with its Black soldiers. His regiment and all the other Black regiments were now combined into the 25th Corps. Now they're sent to Texas. And the map on the right, there's a shoreline, Gulf of Mexico, and there's one river, and if you follow it down below the colored picture, it's the Rio Grande. And you see that it passes through Brownsville, Texas on the one side and Matamoros, Mexico on the other. Now, during the war, this was a great problem point for the Union because Confederates, plantations producing cotton, would pass it over the border to Matamoros so it could be shipped out through Mexican ports, which of course were not blockaded by the Union Navy. But look at this island of dirt, of sand, of nothing. This is where they're deposited. And this is one of the big military scandals of the war that frequently gets overlooked. And even today, in and around this area, there's a Texas historic monument to an old Mexican war fort that was located here, which was now in ruins. It was ruined by the time that the 25th Corps arrived. Also, these couple other signs acknowledged some fighting in the area and Union troops, but they only acknowledged white troops. There are no markers here to the immense amount of Black troops that were simply dumped here and not resupplied. They were effectively just dumped here and forgotten. And Brownsville, Texas, the main street looked like this. And Black soldiers began to suffer because they could not get fresh food. Scurvy hit almost 80% of all the troops stationed there. Another malarial attack arises for Dorsey, and he is placed in the hospital then for a very long time, for a couple of months, and gets out just in time for the troops to be moved back out, shipped back to Philadelphia, and mustered out. And for the rest of his life, he continues to experience these periodic malarial attacks. And he reported to doctors later on that he was hit by these malarial attacks about 4 times a year, each one lasting for about a week to 10 days duration. But after the war, there was a big inquiry about what went wrong. Why did the Army just behave poorly in not supplying these soldiers, simply ignoring them, even sending out very experienced combat veterans who only died of scurvy or starvation out in this place because the Army simply ignored them until they were mustered out. And the Army, of course, responded by the only way that made sense to them. It was to blame the victim. And as you see in yellow here, the Army responded that, well, it's these Black soldiers. They just can't respond to extreme conditions like white soldiers. Therefore, it's their own fault. They starved. But it clearly was the ambition of Dorsey to return to Maryland, but have his own farm in a state where he could be free. and have a family and create what we call today, inheritable wealth, a farm that he could pass down. And of course, farming was the blessed by God ultimate ambition, or it should have been, of people before the war, of men, white or black, to be your own man, have your own family. You have a farm, you live off the land, you build a community, you build your home and your family this way. This apparently was the ambition. And he teamed up with a very young guy named Armstead Williams and moved out to Maryland in a rural area, Caroline County for the most part, but not entirely in that area, started to buy some land and do some farming. He got in the newspapers with Armstead because they became a little local celebrities. The white press covered how they would occasionally perform feats of strength to amuse the kids. Apparently, Dorsey or Dawson, Dorsey again by now, had great upper body strength and I guess compensated for his lame leg, which he just somehow accommodated. So he's married, he has a family, and this becomes a bit of a problem later on. Not the fact that he was married, but when pensions come into the picture. Now, where Huidekoper applies for pensions fairly early after his discharge from the military, once pensions became available after about 1864, Dorsey did not. He waited almost 20 years before applying for a pension. And this would not be unusual for somebody who had escaped enslavement, who was not literate, not conversant at all with white infrastructure. You might be suspicious, as some were, of going to the government and asking for aid and wondering, what's the government going to take from me in return for this? But he marries, has a child. The marriage did not work out, and the couple separated. And in 1880, Dorsey marries again. I have Preston Dorsey in quotation marks here because this man is a bit hard to fix in the historical record, partly because the name keeps changing, where he's from keeps changing, his date of birth keeps changing. He went by Preston, Presley, Presley with a T, or Press. So he marries a second time. This will become a problem for him with the government, as you'll see in a little bit. We know that he participated in some veterans' activities, and we're going to see this with Huidekoper, but in a big way. We know that there were Black-only GAR posts formed in Maryland. At the moment, I have no evidence that he, in fact, was in any of those. But the one artifact that does survive to the present day, which we exhibited in our Civil War exhibit, was this badge of a very common type that were available at various veterans reunions and gatherings, where somebody was there to stamp out your name on it, stamp out his regiment and so on. So it's got his company H, 43rd, MD for Maryland in the bottom, and then the symbol for the 25th Corps. We know nothing about how he got this or how often he wore it, except his second wife, in claiming for a pension, uses the badge as essentially her claim of identity to be the wife of this man. Now, you think about it, we carry ID for all kinds of purposes, but if you're somebody with a background like Dorsey's, what do you have? You don't have birth certificates. You don't have other documents to prove you are who you say you are. You have to rely on artifacts like this, which was duly presented to pension authorities and duly recorded as having been presented. Now, Huidekoper, on the other hand, in his post-war life, is starting to go places. He is a member of the Union League in Philly. He takes up residence where he will go through a number of prestigious jobs, which you will see in a moment. But he is very much an advocate of veterans, very much an advocate for the memory of the Civil War. If you were a member of the GAR, which doesn't really come into its own as a very big, popular, and important and influential organization until later in the 19th century, you learn that one of the political fixtures of the GAR over time is to keep a very solid and static idea of the union of the country, the purpose of the war, and the necessity to stay vigilant lest this happen again. So the politics of the GAR continued to be, over time, very much anchored in 1861. So Huidekoper is very much that kind of advocate. He also joins Maulus, and the records for that are at the Union League Philadelphia to this day. They have a number of Huidekoper-related materials. So his career in Philly is the woman he marries is somebody known and statusy in society, and starts to have children. He becomes the postmaster of Philadelphia, which is a really big deal job. It's also a political appointee. He only gets tossed with that when there's a Democratic administration that comes in, he being a Republican. But he's on the board of overseers at Harvard. But note these two other important activities of his going forward. He joins the up-and-coming industry, telephones and telegraph. Eventually, this becomes amalgamated with other similar companies to become Bell Telephone. Everybody remember Bell Telephone. And he becomes an agent. In other words, he's selling on behalf of them. Interestingly, he gets in the press occasionally as sort of the point man for public hearings on the erection of new telephone exchanges and telephone wires, because everybody's demanding telephones, and the infrastructure has been rather slow to catch up with that. And he gets nasty remarks thrown at him at public meetings for not going fast enough so that people can get their telephones. So here we are today with our phones in our pockets at all times. So people were hungering for these things back then. He also becomes important to the National Guard and is made a major general and is actually permitted to wear that general's uniform on various state occasions. He is influential with the state, with the Guard in organizing, or I should say reorganizing it. He writes a manual of rules and regulations for it, a copy of which the Union League has. And when there's a big railroad strike across a lot of the northeastern states following the panic of 1873 financial panic, there are riots, and soldiers and police are reluctant to use heavy force on the rioters because there's a great amount of sympathy for railroad workers. Huidekoper decides to help defuse this by not going in force into Pittsburgh, for example, but he goes in civilian clothes by himself into the city and finds his counterparts to negotiate with, and he gets a lot of credit for bringing a peaceful solution to the problem of that moment. But Huidekoper becomes a very strong public advocate for Civil War memory, in particular in talking about Gettysburg. He makes frequent speeches about Gettysburg. He cites Gettysburg as not only a turning point of the war, but the big emblem for Pennsylvanians on what it means to have a country that falls apart and must be reintegrated into a union. But in 1902, now we're in the 20th century now, he decides he ought to have a Medal of Honor. Now, he has been going around with a pinned up sleeve for the arm that he no longer has, and he does not wear a prosthetic limb. And statistics show that relatively few men who were eligible for prosthetic arms actually wore them. And in some cases, it was more worth their while if they had one missing arm to wear the sleeve as a flap. It became a bit of a badge of honor. The interesting thing is, if you had multiple injuries, laid both arms missing, that's a whole different matter. You are not socially accepted. In fact, you are looked at as a moral failure. But one arm seems to be acceptable. But in 1902, he talks to some surviving senior officers of the Union Army who remember him and were there at Gettysburg, in particular, General Oliver Otis Howard, who writes a letter on his behalf requesting a Medal of Honor. The letter gets refused. And the answer the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War makes is, sorry, we could consider this if this man was still in active service when the medal was requested. But now he's been out of service for decades, so we can't give him a medal. Huidekoper, who is a man who's made connections, then goes to his friend, Colonel John Nicholson, who is the chair of the new Gettysburg Committee to make a national military park. He has the right connections. And lo and behold, he knocks on a few doors, and Huidekoper gets another letter saying, we are pleased to award you a Medal of Honor, and here is your certificate. So from this point on, his military files are all stamped in red, Medal of Honor awardee, for whatever good that did for him. If you've been into Germantown and seen this monument, and this is a postcard from years and years ago, and the monument's still there, but the surround looks a bit different now. That's the picture that I took a couple years ago. This is Huidekoper speechifying, and he was the speaker at the unveiling of the statue to memorialize Civil War soldiers. Now, at about this time, he starts to undergo other medical examinations because he's requesting an enlarged pension. And he's also advocating for increased pensions for veterans who were amputees. He was advocating, for example, $100 pensions for soldiers that have lost both hands and feet. That didn't quite get there, but the GAR, as you know, becomes a big, important pressure agency as the number one expenditure of the federal budget becomes veterans' pensions. And GAR, at this point, 1880s, 1890s, into the first decade of the 20th century, has a lot of political clout. And Huidekoper is very much part of this. He's meeting legislators. He's advocating for increases. Now, the interesting thing is when he goes for a medical exam, the medical exams are there for pension increases. No other reason why the government would give you a medical examination later on. But it had a bad habit. Since the pension exam was entirely to determine, do you get a pension? Do you get less of a pension? Or do you get more of a pension? Once they see you walk in the door missing a limb, they don't bother to check anything else. They just waive the exam, say, okay, that's all we need to see. It's as if the pensioner might not have any other problem connected with, say, the amputation or the injury. So the amputation essentially gets you off the hook, bad pun, for amputations and prosthetic limbs, and they just signed it off. The pension, if you look at pension documents, they're interesting mirror documents because the applicant for the increase in pension has to say, here are my problems. And then the rest of the form is the surgeon's or the doctor's response to, here's how I see those problems, and here's what I'm going to recommend. And what the doctor recommends is not necessarily what the pension office is going to give. Now, let me shift for a moment to the link between all these white soldiers, Dr. Eswer Mitchell. His friend, Hammond, who was the first wartime Surgeon General, was a friend of his. And Mitchell said, you know, I'm a contract surgeon, and I am seeing all kinds of interesting things happen to the nervous system of the body when I treat these Civil War soldiers, whether they're amputees or they just have severe gunshot wounds. And I want a special ward set up so that I can examine these soldiers exclusively with two of my fellow doctors. Hammond granted that. It started at this place, Turner's Lane Hospital, which none of this exists anymore, and it's very hard to find the location of where that was anymore, too. But he also moves around to other hospitals, one on Christian Street and one finally close to downtown. And he is using some unusual therapies that are both diagnostic and therapeutic, he hopes, because not enough is known about the responses of the human nervous system to these sorts of traumatic injuries, and particularly the strange pains that come out of these. And I said earlier that there's one thing about Dr. Mitchell that you will all recognize, even if you don't know his name. He's the one that identified and described the phantom limb syndrome, the idea that you could have an amputated arm, leg, hand, and still feel a sensation. Now, the sensation is usually a painful one or one that's difficult to sustain. In other words, you might be missing a hand and feel that hand, but what you're going to feel is the hand in a tight clenched position, and your mind wants to send a signal to it to loosen up, let the fingers go. That signal is what ignites the pain. And how this all happens is still a big medical mystery and another story for another time. But even electrical treatments was one of the innovatory treatments that Mitchell was giving to his patients. Now, Mitchell did not see Huidekoper during wartime, but he sees him as in social contexts. And here's Mitchell later on, probably around the time Huidekoper's Surgeon General, seeing a veteran, and other colleagues are watching Mitchell. Notice how Mitchell is sitting very close to this man, holding his arm and talking about his body. What really interested Mitchell was pain. Pain can increase, it can decrease, it can go away, it can come back, it can get worse, it can move to another part of the body. And he's seeing all of that happen with his Civil War soldiers that he was treating, whether amputees or from serious wounds. This is a problem for pension authorities because anybody can show up and say, hey, doc, I got a big pain. What are you going to do about it? The doctor can take your word for it. How does the doctor verify that you, in fact, have the pain that this patient says is there? So Mitchell finds that there are degrees of pain, some of them extremely severe pain, that soldiers are enduring in hospital, and he sees this in a very systematic way. And one of his colleagues writes a treatise on malingering to talk about this and about how that one might spot some of this pain and know whether it's real or not. But it's only Mitchell who has the interest, abiding interest in pain, and writes a treatise about this. Now, Huidekoper speaks to him. Excuse me, before I leave this, that's what the typescript is on the left. This is what caused me to create a Civil War exhibit at the Mütter Museum, was finding this letter. And all those surveys that were returned to Mitchell are in the library at the Mütter Museum. So that is, to my knowledge, the only longitudinal record, health survey that we'd say today, of Civil War soldiers ever conducted. So those snapshots we get of the soldier's life, that doesn't exist for anybody else. Well, Mitchell talks to Huidekoper. Huidekoper was not sent a survey, but he decides to write a letter Mitchell asked for, and he typewrites it in 1906. So we're decently into the 20th century now, and he's writing about what happened to him. And he says, I was wounded at Gettysburg, shot in my arm, went to the, walked the mile, had the surgery. He was very proud of the fact that he never entirely lost consciousness during the whole thing. You know, the chloroform dulled the pain, but he could still be conscious of what was going on and all those rebels staring at him. And Mitchell, and so Huidekoper puts this all in the letter. But then he says in the letter to Mitchell, there's something I want to tell you, but I want you to keep this very, very private. Don't mention my name in connection with this phenomenon, but it's a very personal detail. And he says, when I was after the war at home in a carriage and a gust of wind would blow off my straw hat, I'd reach up with my right hand to grab my hat. And that's the one that's been amputated. So I would learn over time to compensate if something like that happened. I'd reach up with my left hand. And I've accommodated myself well to this. And I'm now 67 years old, and I'm perfectly adjusted. And I've done most of my adult life with only one arm. But what I want to tell you is what happens when I dream. It's not the same situation. When I dream, even today, I'm always a two-handed man. And in my dreams, I like to open a newspaper and read it. And I like to write with this new thing called a fountain pen, because I like the mechanical action of writing. And in my dreams, I'm always doing those things with my right hand. But when I do them, it induces such a pain in my non-existent hand that it wakes me in the middle of the night, even after profound sleep. To this day, that is happening, 1907. That's a hell of a glimpse into the life of a Civil War veteran, into the body of a Civil War veteran. When I saw that letter, I decided we're going to make a Civil War exhibit, and we're going to use these. So that's the letter he writes. So let's go back to Dawson. Dawson, over time, I've got a few pictures just to represent what he might have looked like as he gets older. His malaria comes back, but now the pain in his knee and the pain in his leg is really starting to bother him. So he applies for a pension. Now, he goes through a pension agent who handles all the paperwork, since, of course, he can't do that, and who knows the system. And he has to go before pension doctors to look at him. They see the leg. And it's important to have this kind of document, because having this examination, even getting a rejection, is a way of verifying your identity as a soldier and as a veteran. Now you have paperwork that declares that you are, in fact, a veteran, and you are claiming a debility. Now, he's claiming not the malaria this time, but the knee. He's got rheumatism, which is a very generalized term for all kinds of aches and pains. But the pension doctors are always on notice. And the form actually asks them, does this patient have any vicious habits? In other words, if you are, say, you got venereal disease, or you're addicted to alcohol, that's going to be a vicious habit that could mitigate or aggravate this whole pension process. And also, there's the standard that if you can perform manual labor, you don't get a pension. If you can perform I mean, if you can't perform manual labor, you get the pension. If you can perform manual labor, you don't get a pension, or you get something very much reduced. So people like Huidekoper and white collar professions, some of them, when they are presented with this issue on a pension application, they don't want to list their white collar job. They just say, not fit for manual labor. I was a machinist, or I worked in construction. I think Huidekoper used that label once upon a time. So $6 is what they give Presley Dawson, or Presley Dorsey. They tended to continue using his name Dawson since it's still part of his military record. $6. Now, it's customary in books to take this value and give it to you in today's terms. But there's one crucial piece that's always missing from this. $6 in 1890 was worth somewhere between $230 and $250, I think, in today's money. But what you need to know is, in today's money, that only buys about 4 to 5% of what that pension could buy in 1890. So it's a big difference in buying value. So the pension does have significant value. But they, for some administrative reason, rescind his pension and then finally give it back to him after he applies repeatedly to have it reinstated. And this time they increase it to just $8. But his health is getting worse, and his rheumatism is getting worse. He's starting to lose the ability to use his hand. And now he definitely has problems with that knee. And the doctor can see that the tibia and fibula, those broken pieces at the end where the kneecap should be, are sticking right up through the skin. And this guy's been living with that for decades. But even now, they're suspicious. And is this really a war-related injury? Now, through the years, the pension system keeps changing. And it comes, overall, it's more liberal and accommodating to not only the veterans, but also their spouses and their dependents. But even so, they're reluctant to give pensions for specifically proclaimed war-related injuries when there's no documentation from the wartime moment. But he dies shortly thereafter. Personal property and probate, doesn't look like a lot of money. But the thing that doesn't show here is he has been buying property even though he doesn't own it until a mortgage is satisfied. And at this time, he has purchased a land in an interesting deal with a white landowner who was a Civil War doctor and apparently very supportive of Black formerly enslaved people trying to create farms from scratch. And a plot of land that he bought for thousands of dollars, he sells to Dorsey for just a couple of hundred. Dorsey promptly turns around and he sublets this to a number of tenants who effectively pay the mortgage off after he dies. So that land does convey into the family after he dies and continued in his family into the 20th century, well into the 20th century. But now this is where the marriage comes into play. That second wife with whom he lived the longest and who was there when he died, Janie, not this person, this is just a representative picture. But Janie comes forward, uses the badge, say, I'm married to this guy. I live with him. I can give you affidavits from people who were there when I married him. But the pension office says, and they're firm on this despite Mary's repeated applications, he was not divorced from his first wife. Therefore, you do not have a legitimate marriage. End of it. So she never gets a pension for that reason and moves in with relatives in Westchester and dies in 1922. And the memorial to him is part of the monument in Washington, D.C., which some of you probably have seen. The gentleman on the left is pointing to where Presley's name appears, and this time it's spelled this way. Now, Huidekoper's last days are coming, but he is an indefatigable proponent of the Gettysburg message. And if you can't go to Gettysburg, he's going to make Gettysburg go to you. And he creates relief models about 3 feet by 2 feet that he sells through the mail. And here's a photograph of one of them from the pamphlet advertising it. That is a relief map of the whole Gettysburg battlefield area. And he gets endorsements from 2 surviving ex-Confederate generals, 2 surviving ex-Union generals, and he starts selling these things. I have never found an example of one that still survives. If any of you know about one, I'd sure as heck like to know. But his grand moment comes with the big Pennsylvania Memorial. And here's Huidekoper later in life. As he is helping to get this built, he's involved in every part of the process. And if you go to this monument today, you should look for the bronze plaque for the 150th Pennsylvania, as you see up left, where his name is there. And then go up the stairs and inside to that sort of lobby area under the arches, where there's a dedication plaque to the committee that organized this effort and had it built. And there's Huidekoper's name. He chaired the commission that built this. And on the day of its debut in 1910, he spoke alongside the governor. He was one of the two major speechifiers. He dies just 2 days before the end of World War I. And interesting, they don't do this anymore as far as I know, but when he died, he was placed in his coffin, and it was on show in the Union League itself for a period of days before it was then shipped off to his hometown where he was buried. Now, throughout the book, throughout my study, I deal with issues of manhood. And the issue here is there's a lot of literature about how, and even by people of this period, saying manly virtues are you must be resilient against pain, you must do this, you must do that. There's certain ways you have to show yourself in public, certain ways you behave with respect to your peers, your family, and so on. And here you have two illustrations of how veterans sometimes can't do those things. The one on the left was rather controversial at the time because it shows a former Union soldier missing one arm with his wife at the reins. And there were a lot of veterans that did not like this. The one on the right, which is a very, very popular print, the empty sleeve, appeared mostly in black and white, shows a child playing with the sleeve in a pose that was just like those medieval Madonna and child things, images, icons, paintings, the soldiers looking off into the distance, perhaps thinking about his wound. There's a bucolic scene in the background, just like the medieval paintings. But these images amount to a feminization of the soldier. I won't say anything more about that. There's much more on that point in the book. So if we take this wound's eye view, what do we get? There's a value here to listening to another's wounds, to quote a university professor. As I tried to do, look at these guys' lives from the moment of their battlefield wounding up to the end of their lives, to look at their bodies and how their bodies are shaping their post-war lives. And one thing that's really obvious to me is they may be immersed in this atmosphere of this is what true manhood is, and here's what manliness means. But these veterans, they'll do anything they can to conduct the kind of lives they want to lead. And if it's wearing a prosthetic limb or not, whatever it is. We learned from the pension exams, by the way, in Huidekoper's case, his not wearing a prosthetic limb on the arm got to the point where he couldn't physically do it because a kind of tumor, a neuroma, formed on his stump, which would have prohibited that from happening. But pain, this was the real big question that emerges from the medical point of view. How do you quantify this? How do you pension it? How do you handle it when it changes? Some of the veterans I portray in my book had some very, very bizarre experiences with pain throughout the rest of their lives. But one thing they all have in common is they all existed in three bodies. They had their civic body, the body that they maintained to their family and to their community. They had their veterans life, their veterans body, where if they participated in veterans activities, they had a very different kind of persona and much more politically oriented to a common goal of the GAR. To the pension authorities, they had yet another body where they might even had to lie and say, I can't perform manual labor because before the war, I made machine parts, when in fact they had white collar jobs after the war. That was not considered manual labor. Again, there's a hint of desk work is feminizing work. Real man work is out with your hands in the dirt and the soil. But the pension, I have to defer a little bit to pension authorities because the pension system that evolved by the time we get up to World War I is essentially the pension system upon which every pension system in the country today is based. So whatever pension that you benefit from, you have to thank the Civil War experience. So that brings me to my end. And I want to leave you with this. In case any of you have a cell phone handy and just want to get that book right away, you can scan this code, because from now until February, you can either go online and use the code Union Vets when you do checkout at the Indiana University Press website, and you get 30% off. Or you can scan this code and get 30% off. So that's for you. So thank you very much for listening.